Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you have been having a stimulating, insightful conversation today around how we can mitigate an unequal return to school. Certainly, I know when the organizers were planning this conference, we had no idea all of the traumatic, horrific events that we would be witnessing. And it only brings into sharper relief how important the issues of this conference are. And it only brings into sharper relief how long and how entrenched these issues of anti-Blackness and systemic racism are in our society, and how they continue to emerge in different ways over and over again over time. But hopefully what we're here to do today is to think about how we can seriously pivot and make some real changes in our society for the next generation in so many of the ways that we continue to build on the work that people who've come before us, but we have not made enough progress. So I'm so pleased to be able to join you today and help moderate what I hope will be an insightful and inspirational conversation for thinking about how we can move forward. I'm joined today by 4 terrific panelists who are going to bring, I know, a lot of expertise and insights to this conversation. They are Professor Todd Blake Finley at East Carolina University, Professor Carolyn Heinrich at Vanderbilt University, David Johnson at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, and Professor Masheri Keels at the University of Chicago. So thank all of you for joining us today for this conversation. We're going to start with some brief presentations by each of these individuals, and then we will have some time for some crosstalk and to dig into some of these issues. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Todd Blake Finley first.
Thank you, Vivian. It's good to be here, and it's great to be among people who care so much about the issues that we're talking about today. So I want to just start off by saying that there's a couple of education-related experiences that guide my thinking around these issues. One is that I was a teacher at Heart of the Earth Survival School. It was an Ojibwe school in the late 80s. That was when Prince's Sign of the Times album came out, which is his best album. Also, I research schools that are transformational for Edutopia. For their Schools That Work series. So I get to ask school leaders and school teachers, how do you make this work and what are you doing? And there's a whole lot of trauma-informed discussions and focus among those schools. So I'm learning a lot from that. And let me just also start with a couple of limitations. One is that anti-racist work is best received from people who are of color, and I'm painfully white and heterosexual, and this is certainly a watershed moment in our country's history and for the world, really. There's another limitation that I also want to note, which is that I can't see, given the current COVID situation, us cramming kids into windowless classrooms, breathing the same circulated air, using the same toilets, and that just seems untenable. So whatever we're doing in the fall is not going to feel normal at all. And let me briefly mention a couple studies and then some implications for that. So in 2018, the Children's Defense Fund, they did a study and found that 1 in 6 children live in poverty, and 73% of those children are of color. 1 in 6 live in poverty, 73% are children of color. And then last week, RAND did a study that showed that only 25% of students completed their remote assignments this spring. Whereas schools that primarily serve kids living in low-income communities or students of color, only 9% of that demographic completed their remote assignments. So that's a 16% gap, and it's so this is certainly the issues that are occurring right now are unequally distributed. So in other words, the implications are that the academic slide from COVID will intensify for kids who face disparities of sleep, security, Wi-Fi, time, nutrition, money. And as I like to say, Maslow's always supersedes Bloom's, so that means we need to attend to their needs before we attend to their cognitive development. So so this approach tells me that we need to race towards empathy for the whole child, also race towards culturally responsive curriculum, and then also trauma-informed practice, which are the only humane curricula to adopt during this communal trauma. And let me just end by giving one quick example of what this looks like. One of the schools that I researched in the fall was a school in Missouri, and they had a very large homeless population of students. And so I was really moved when I saw a video of them handing out these plain backpacks to their homeless students. And they're plans so that, you know, they don't get stolen and don't cause attention to the kids. And they're filled with peanut butter and wheat thins, clean socks, Cliff Bars, nail clippers, and then also a handwritten note that says, "You are important to us. You matter to us. We care," which is, again, it's a backpack filled with blooms. There's one other thing that's special that's added to these backpacks, and that is they're given a key, and this key unlocks a special room in the school. It's a private school laundry room that has a washer and dryer that kids have access to and go there before or after school. And so the reason here is A, it's humane, and B, it gives students access to clean clothes that significantly boosts attendance. So this is one way that we need to think about the whole child and about the systemic issues that are obstacles to their development, and one way of balancing the scales.
Thank you so much, Professor Finley. Let's move to our second speaker, Johnson.
All right. So I want to take just a moment to acknowledge how many different entry points there are for the conversations that we've been having throughout the day today, and to really foreground my appreciation for all of the panelists, both on this panel here in closing, but also throughout the day today. It's been an incredibly rich and frankly, really hopeful experience in a lot of ways. There's certainly plenty to be concerned about, and I know we'll talk more about that as we go, but there's also been a great deal about which to be hopeful, and even frankly, in some instances, I think excited. I want to take a moment too to thank all of the people who've worked behind the scenes to make this possible. This is an enormous amount of work to pull off, and the degree to which it has happened relatively seamlessly is a testament to how much has gone into putting it all together. And I also want to thank Dr. Keels for all of the work that went into organizing this and bringing together these people across all of these different expertise. This is really an honor to be a part of. Yeah, I want to really start by thinking a little bit about how we think about and understand vulnerability. And I know that we've heard a lot in various different quarters about vulnerable children and risk factors and thinking about resilience. But I really want to foreground again this idea that millions of children all over this country pre-COVID, and I think Dr. Finley highlighted this just a moment ago in a really nice way, experience all sorts of different hardships, many of them overlapping. Poverty is a particular constellation of factors. We often talk about those in terms of structural violence. And children across the country experienced structural violence at multiple levels pre-COVID. and teachers were working, and counselors were working, and administrators were working throughout schools in any number of different ways pre-COVID to think about these issues. And now post-COVID, or in the midst of COVID, I should say, we know that we're dealing with something that's an order of magnitude more complex. Structural vulnerability, that intersection of ways in which children experience housing instability, food insecurity, and a whole litany of other interconnected vulnerabilities really is only just beginning to help us think about what it ultimately means to try to address these issues. I want to hold up three things that I'm thinking of and that I'm hoping are helpful to share as we step into this space. One is to echo something that I think is really critically important and that I think I've heard on a couple of the other panels today, which is to say that as much concern as we have with the issue of unequal or inequitable capacity to participate in remote learning, and I think we see that a lot in the discussions right now about learning loss. I think it's critically important to interrogate the assumption that children who've not participated in remote learning have not been learning. We're in the midst of an unprecedented global pandemic, and in the midst of the flowering of one of the most important social movements in certainly my generation, to suggest that the children who have been absent from our various remote classroom environments have been learning nothing or have been falling behind is to make a particular kind of assumption about what it is that's been taking place in the lives of those children and what its value is to us as educators, that I think we owe it to ourselves, but more importantly to our students, their families and communities to interrogate really carefully. And I think my first point connects to that, in that I think what I really want to put forward as an important objective here is that we think broadly as a field about the way that we understand and assess not only children's learning, but also their well-being. We have systems, many of them built around standardized testing, but also around a fairly consistent set of grading practices that, frankly, for quite some time have been reinforcing various different dimensions of oppression for children of color in particular. And I think we've heard some really provocative and interesting ways in which folks on panels throughout the day today have been questioning the adequacy of those assessment paradigms for thinking about what it is that we ultimately need to be responsive to. When we say empathy is one of the most important qualities and in the shortest supply in a moment like this, I think it's really important for us to consider what data we actually have at our disposal, but also what else we might need to collect in order to actually understand and engage directly with the lived experiences of our students and their families and their communities during this time. And I think to that point, then I'll also say I think it's really critically important for us to think about the work of administrators and district leaders in creating the kinds of systems and structures within schools, as well as the resources that support educators in ongoing and reflective practice around not only instruction in the remote environment, but also the health of, and here I really mean the extent and the depth and the quality of the relationships that they have with students. If a different assessment paradigm points us towards something that's more holistically oriented towards the full experience of the child, then this other way of thinking about supporting teachers also needs to move us beyond thinking about assessment as simply a reflection of a child's capacity or achievement, and bring us to a place where we see it as a reflection of educators' practice and adults' success or struggle in engaging with children. And finally, I'll just say in closing that I think in order to do either of those other two things well, I think it's really critical that we focus on strengthening the infrastructure and resources that we provide to schools in order to enable adults to collaborate more effectively with one another, particularly across difference by race and by class. And I think in the current moment, it's really critical to raise this idea that we're all affected by the COVID pandemic. But we're also all affected by white supremacy culture. And we are all implicated in the systems that we're talking about and thinking about trying to change. We're not always all responsible for the ways in which those systems operate, and the kind of colorblind race discourse that exists in this country that emphasizes the idea that I as a white person, I'm not racist, I'm not responsible for this, misses the point that we're all accountable for it, and that we all live every day together with the implications. But those implications are very different depending on how each of us is situated. And I think as we think about what we're moving towards in the fall, whether it's in person or remote or some hybrid of the two, there's a great deal of opportunity in the disruption that exists right now to choose not to go back to business as usual, and to recognize that business as usual was actually never working very well for any of us, even as many of us were advantaged by a system that continued to take advantage of children of color throughout our school systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. I accidentally leapfrogged over our second speaker. You guys will have to forgive me, even though I've been on Zoom every single day for 12 weeks. I am still running into challenges with it. So let me go back to Professor Carolyn Heinrich. Wonderful to see you, Carolyn.
Thank you, Vivian. So can you just advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we've been hearing this call to action all day, right? We understand that even actually before the pandemic and before we saw George Floyd, murdered in broad daylight by those who were supposed to protect and serve him, we knew that children's mental health was deteriorating, along with parents as well. Those trends have been very definitive. I'm going to be sharing some insights today from research that's funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We have a Policies for Action research lab in which we're linking children's health and education data, but we're also on the front lines interviewing those people who are working to meet children's and family needs, mental health, healthcare, education, and primarily in many under-resourced areas. And this is really critical because we know that poor children, children of color, are more likely to suffer because of these traumas, and that these have enduring disadvantages. We see what happens when they're absent from school more often, when they struggle to stay, keep up with their peers. And that's in part because we have not provided the resources for them. And so this is particularly critical in thinking about the impact of the pandemic, because as we've learned, for many of these children underserved in rural communities where they're either socially or geographically isolated, the school-based health centers and the resources our schools provide have been their primary source and sometimes their only source of access to basic health care, mental health care, and many other supports, as we just heard described, the backpack programs, having their laundry done at school and all kinds of food pantries at school and things like that. Can we advance to the next slide? The other thing, if you've been listening today, you've heard people talk about this has impacts not just on those children, but also on those who are trying to work with them. So we were disturbed when at the beginning of the school year, we were hearing people talk about, middle schoolers and sixth graders with suicide attempts or suicide ideation. By the end of the year, we'd heard that all the way down to second grade and kindergartners with suicide ideation. And schools just aren't equipped to deal with this level of need at younger and younger ages. Can you advance to the next slide, please? So one of the resources we identified through our interviews that has been really critical is these Advancing Wellness and Resilience Education, or AWARE grants. They're funded by the Substance Use and Mental Health Administration. They give them to state educational agencies, which are supposed to help expand the capacity for schools to do this. And we've talked to those who have received those grants, and just I want to give you a quote from one of them. A school-based health coordinator says the need is just continuing to grow, and our school counselors, most of them who are also teaching in the classroom part of the day, have so many, because they have so many bodies in need and so few dollars to go around. Those counselors are also feeling very stressed because no matter how much time and how hard they try to reach the needs of these kids, when they go home at the end of the day, they still don't feel good. So even those that have received this AWARE grant find that it just allows them to tap the surface, to identify the need that they have not been meeting all these years, and they're immediately overwhelmed. Right now, they're 5-year grants, so, and there are only a handful. For example, in Tennessee, where we're studying, there were first only 3 grants across the entire state. There's 5 new grantees, but those first 3 grantees lost those resources, and some of them can't sustain it. One school-based health coordinator told me that their resources for school-based health center have been the same level, the same dollar amount since 2006. That does not only not reflect the fact that we've had these massive increase in mental health care needs among our students, but we're expecting schools to work with the same level of resources as this need has expanded. And so, you know, one of, I think, an immediate policy action we could take is we need to call for an expansion of these grants. Everyone we've talked to said that they're really critical to expanding this capacity. Schools are so stretched. The other problem we need to do is break down those barriers to access to those services, the administrative burdens. You know, right now you've heard a lot of people talk about how telehealth, oh, we can do telehealth, right? It's really an important idea because in many areas, especially where they're geographically isolated, where the need is so hard, they can't begin to serve they can't get enough counselors, they can't get enough psychologists, they can't get enough social workers to meet all those needs. So breaking down those barriers. So part of it is buy-in. There's all the equipment that's required, but also what we've really heard is, again, it comes down to financial and administrative constraints. When you have to make it work, for example, we talked to someone who's part of the Ronald McDonald House. They have a mobile telehealth clinic that goes around so they can actually expand those services to different school districts. What they find is that they can only sustain that with a sufficient payer mix of actually paying, and there's so many uninsured children or children who, like in Tennessee, the state with the highest number of children who left the rolls, we are not getting all of our economically disadvantaged children onto healthcare programs. So, you know, obviously one great solution would be to provide free healthcare to all, or nationalized healthcare. In the absence of that, at a minimum, we need to expand Medicaid so that we don't have poor or near poor families and children without that access, and we can expand these kinds of services. So I'm going to stop now because I know we have more panelists to fit in.
Thank you so much. Let's go now to Professor Masheri Keels. Masheri, you are on mute.
Of course, I'm the one on mute still as I begin to talk, even though I've been on Zoom today alone since 9 a.m. But good to see you all, as you know, and all of you others teachers can relate to the struggles that we are having. So as you are doing this with your students, I'm just going to share my screen very quickly so that I can show you, revisit some slides that I had this morning. So let's, okay, there we go in slideshow. And it's just, I just think it's just critical to reiterate from, if you were not here this morning when I did the welcome, showed these slides. And it's, all this is a snapshot of just generation of inequities that are revealing themselves, or as many are saying, being magnified or being shown through COVID-19. And it's only because of death rates are a very solid and unfortunately final and hard count that allows things to be very, very visible. And so what this shows are, it's a few weeks, as of a few weeks ago, the state departments that reported the death rates by COVID by race. This compares, the ones that are most clear in their reporting is the Black comparison of the percent of the population in the state that's Black. That is the bluey teal color, the tealish color, and the purple color are the percent of COVID death rates that are Black. And it's said the outpacing, just the disproportionate rate at which Black individuals are dying as a result of COVID infections is, again, like I said, this is not about COVID. COVID just came along and magnified all of the things that were underlying and not very visible. It just made them very, very visible. And this is also, when you think about why students are protesting, why there is such unrest, is because all of these things that are often not very visible are underlying and that are occurring every day, every year. We know that there are lots of disparities in health and education, in economic factors. And so COVID just made them very visible. And I'll show the remaining states where they have data for. Again, so that you can see wherever you may be, if the numbers are up here, just how large the disparities are. And the other reason to look at this and think about this is these are the disparities that are going to show up again when kids come back to the classroom. So as I stated this morning, particularly children in Black families, they will have lost the most caregivers to deaths. They will have the steepest plunge into poverty and housing instability, and they will have the longest climb out. So yes, we will see behavioral differences by race and socioeconomic status in the fall. If it's in-person schooling or whatever it may be, it is not the child. It is all of those contexts and circumstances. And so just the importance of keeping context in mind to understand that there are many things that we cannot see that's underlying the behaviors that students are exhibiting. And so I just want to point out three quick actions to think about that are associated with the inequities. The first is just plain and clear. Those experiencing the most exposure are the least able to bear it. So one thing to first think about is to reestablish, to me, and this is also part of like a priority order, reestablish the learning community. So there's lots of talk about the unequal, about the learning loss. And so, but very little talk about the behavioral learning loss. There were many school behavioral routines and expectations and ways of being and ways of interacting that for many of our most vulnerable children are unique to school. Their home life doesn't replicate that. For some other children who are more advantaged, their home life, since in remote learning, continues to replicate the behavioral learning that they got in school. Somebody still gets them up in the morning and says, okay, you're gonna go over here, you're gonna sit at this desk with this computer or this set of worksheets, you're gonna work on them for this period of time, you're gonna get a break, you're gonna get back to work on them again. So in some families and kids, they've maintained that structured learning environment so that whenever in-person schooling resumes, it will be an easier re-entry into that environment. For many of our other kids and our most vulnerable kids, they will have completely be out of a structured learning environment. And so it's going to take quite some time and support to reestablish and and just those routines for learning how to be with self and with other and be in community. The second is ensure that all teachers plan for differentiated instruction. I'm kind of tired of hearing about the average learning loss. And that's because just that there is no such thing as an average learning loss when we think about how kids are experiencing it and how teachers will experience this when they return in the fall. The challenge to me is not the learning loss. If everybody received the same level of learning loss, then it would be much easier to pick up whenever in-person learning resumes to move everybody along. The problem is that this learning in this period has been substantially unequal by many factors that only advantage the kids who were already ahead. And so the idea of teaching to the whole class in any way should really just be removed in terms of how teachers are planning for how learning will resume. And there's some studies that have that are using data for kids engagement with remote learning for kids who were on in schools that were using some virtual learning, digital learning apps before COVID. What they've done is continued tracking access and utilization and engagement of that after COVID. And what they found is that more kids in more advantaged schools, but even more important to me is that it's the kids who had the highest levels of proficiency before COVID that are showing the most continued engagement with those learning platforms post-COVID. And so the widening in the learning gap and in the knowledge gap for school-related and academic learning is going to be huge. So just all teachers should be preparing and planning and learning how to do differentiated instruction at a level that has never been seen before. And just the last that I want to point out is to rethink the distribution of access to the strongest teachers. So there's lots of talk about using testing and diagnostic tools in order to place students, either retain them in grade or to place them in remedial learning classes. If we're honest about how our system currently works, placing students in remedial classes is not associated with an increased access to educational resources. And so if anything along the lines of diagnostic testing would be used to place students in remedial classes, there has to be coupled with a rethinking about who is teaching those classes, and that the strongest teachers are being coupled with the students who need the most support. And so those are just really the points that I want to add to this.
Thanks so much. Well, those are certainly an important set of comments to get us started with. So there's a bunch of questions that have been generated over the course of today, and so I'm going to try to get through some of them. One of them, I think, that is on the minds of so many educators is what is going to be asked of them this fall. So that, and there's the worry, especially I think for many teachers, that they will bear the burdens not only of addressing the academic learning needs, but also the social, emotional, mental health needs of students. And then we're talking about adults, many of them who themselves have suffered loss and trauma. So how do we begin to think about this, this challenge as folks think about returning to school? Yes, Carolyn.
So I want to pick up on this point you made and something Sherry just said, and that is that the digital tools that we've been using with our students, and this is something we learned in our research funded by the WT Grant Foundation on equity and quality in digital learning. Those tools aren't really designed for kids that don't have good supports for using them, or they're designed more for the average kid, not for the kid who might be in under-resourced educational environment, whether it's home or school. And the challenge we also saw working in urban districts where kids regularly face a lot of trauma, like Milwaukee Public Schools, is that the more those kids are struggling with those traumas, the harder it is even for them to engage in learning. So that's why I feel it's so important that we provide as many resources for schools and school districts to deal with this, the expected much greater trauma, because those students will not be able to concentrate and focus without it. And we don't have adequate supports, especially in the under-resourced schools, to help them accelerate their learning. So we sometimes use digital tools to personalize learning and do that. But again, unless we are providing adequate supports, it's very difficult to do, and very difficult if you aren't addressing those children's underlying traumas before they can really focus on learning and engage.
So part of what I hear you saying, Carolyn, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we know quite a bit from what existed pre-COVID and from prior research to be able to anticipate that it will be an even more challenging situation in the fall for Black and Brown students and for the schools that serve Black and Brown low-income students. And so that has implications for how we direct resources to make sure that actually it's not about equal resources, but that perhaps we should be thinking about how to direct more resources to those places that we can anticipate will need them more. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And, just to, schools, what we've heard too is schools are the front line for observing those needs of students. So one of the concerns I also heard is that some students may have been in home environments where they're experiencing even more trauma besides things related to COVID, and no one's been there to observe that and to ensure they're getting their therapy along the way. So reconnecting those students with services and then having more of those types of services available will be essential for those kids. It may have been, it's been very hard for schools and school districts to reach those kids during this time, and especially in homes where they don't have consistent access to some kind of email or technology, or there may be different caregivers responsible for any one child, so they may not have a consistent care provider either in those homes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how else I'm wondering if we could bring in some of the other folks and your thoughts about how we can shore up the range of supports for the students who will need it the most. So it doesn't just fall on teachers who are already overburdened. Yes, David, please.
No, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about, you often hear folks right now talking about trying to repurpose existing resources in novel ways. Some of the higher functioning school teams in Chicago public schools for years now, especially at the high school level, have really been organized around the idea of kind of case managing towards solutions to problems like high school dropout and low graduation rates. And so the consortium's produced a number of reports over the years looking at efforts to increase course passing in 9th grade, and organized, schools have organized teacher teams around this idea of getting all of the different high school teachers together that work with an individual kid and running through lists of kids, who's got an F in what class, and how can we think about what it is that child needs. Oh, you have that child 3rd period for algebra. I have him in 5th period for English. I happen to actually have a pretty good relationship with his mom, and I know X and Y, and so on and so forth. And what ends up happening is you get a coordinated net of adults that catch kids before they actually fall, or at least before they fall very far. I think one of the things that's important about that work, and I was attempting to allude to this in pushing this idea that we need to think differently about how we treat assessment data in this moment, is that one of the critical pieces of those nets of adults is that you have to learn to treat your data on kids as data points about your own practice. And so you have to see the kid who has an F not as being delinquent in some form or fashion, but as being a reflection of the practice that you have not yet adopted in your classroom that will enable them to succeed. And when adults have been able to wrap around each other in supporting each other to interpret data that way and to use that data to address kids' needs in ways that don't pathologize kids' difficulty, I think there's a really important and exciting model there for thinking about how we could relieve the burden that might fall on any individual teacher to be responsive. But I do think it raises some important issues about how we continue to resource teachers to do that, because then you need to be able to call in clinicians at points that you think you need to be able to draw on their expertise.
Thank you. And Todd, I see you nodding along. Can I invite you to join and offer your thoughts?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Can I just say I've been taking notes about what everyone's saying, and when we got to Masheri and she said Black students lost will have lost most of their parents by the time they come back to school. I almost lost it. And I just to talk about me, because that's important, is like about once a day, I go in the bathroom, I play Sarah Bareilles, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I have a good cry in the shower, and then I'm good for the rest of the day. So that hasn't happened yet today, but it almost happened today. I want to mention a couple of things that I've noticed about high-performing schools and how they have allocated their resources when they're working with students who are highly diverse and also have lots of poverty. And I've noticed that almost all of them that we've studied from Edutopia is that they all have someone who is in charge. Their only job is to reach out to the community and to find out how the parents are doing. Finding out if they need parenting classes or do they need job training classes, and hooking the parents up and giving the parents enough support. Making that outreach, which is really important, because when we're talking about disenfranchised groups, we're talking about parents and their parents and their parents who have had usually really traumatic relationships with the school system. So there's a lot of suspicion. So that outreach needs to happen. I'd say the other thing that, in terms of allocation of resources, is that I think there's too much canned professional development that occupies teachers' time. It's overwhelming the amount of fairly comprehensive and superficial kinds of training that's done, and teachers need a lot of time. They need a lot of time to sit and talk together about what the different students are facing and how to help those students. So those are two things that I've seen in those high-performing schools.
And maybe I could just try to draw on the collective wisdom of this group of researchers to talk about what does constitute high quality professional development, because we're talking about a lot of professional development needs for teachers. And even in the best of circumstances, our teachers are not always getting the professional development that they need. So what do we know from research about what constitutes high quality professional development? And I will invite any of you to jump in.
I guess I can start and share a little bit. I would say from one of the things that we've been learning because we've done now 4 cycles of iterative professional development work around trauma with schools, and what it looks like, it started out very evidence informed, but still what it looks like today is very different from what it looked like the first year, because it's been done with in collaboration with teachers and with schools, and we even brought teachers in for a summer residency at the university to help us develop some of our tools and materials, and just making what we kind of know about it needing to be practice, job embedded, practice based. Just what we've learned about what that really looks like is very different from when we started, in terms of teachers are so busy. They are receiving so many different pieces of input, and it keeps changing throughout the year, the expectations or the new policy and different things like that, or a new procedure, that it's really difficult to, if we're trying to change practices, we might be able to get them to think differently, but then they also need time and coaching support in order to be able to take new learning that's coming to them in professional development and make the changes and adaptations needed to make it work in their classrooms and in their schools. So just the need that professional development is coupled with so many job embedded practice tools that they can then make this actionable in their classroom. They like, the things that we know work for kids, we often don't think about applying many of those same things to the adults. But one of them, I would say, is a stressed teacher can't really learn, just like kids. A stressed child can't really learn. So we need to think about that piece of it and make sure that we are delivering professional development in short chunks and with practice components, so that we're not just adding to their stress load. And I think that would be one of the main things, if I can say, that we really live what we mean by making it job embedded and practice related.
And I would build on what Sherry said and just say that the same way we were talking about kids coming back to school at whole different levels of what their, what happened to them in learning, teachers come to professional development with varying levels of knowledge and expertise in specific areas. And so when they get this one, or someone I think used the term canned or one size fits all professional development, they're supposed to take it all in one session. What we've learned is that, no, that doesn't happen. When we look at like pre-existing knowledge of teachers or experience of teachers before professional development sessions, and then look at what happens afterwards and how they use that, it varies greatly by their initial experience levels. And so I figured, and we've also heard that just has to be ongoing. And so you need to identify where teachers are and then build from where they are in successive professional development. The other thing I would just like to say, I mean, we're still at the place, I think, and Sherry and I have had conversations about this, where we're talking about, trauma-informed, helping teachers, understand. And I think a lot of schools have done a good job of helping educate teachers there. But I still see the teacher in the classroom, having done hundreds of classroom observations in our WT grant project, who, they know that, they're trying to work with a child who's standing on a desk and screaming and they can't calm down. They're trying to work with that child. They don't want to just take that child out of class, but 20 minutes into doing that, they need more help. And because the other kids in the class are then experiencing learning loss too. But I think we need to move from trauma-informed to actually meeting the needs of those children better, right? So not just a teacher, we can't expect teachers to be able to be psychologists, the counselor, the social worker on that moment. We need to get the kids the help they need so that doesn't happen in the classroom.
So partly what I'm hearing, Carolyn, is goes back to what David was saying about a set of coordinated adults that are working together to provide the coordinated supports that young people need to be successful. That's partly what I'm hearing. And also, what I'm hearing about what high quality professional development looks like, and which we know actually from quite a bit, decades of research on educator professional development, is what doesn't work is pulling teachers out at some point in time for a workshop and then sending them back into the classroom to then somehow implement it. I think I heard Ms. Sherry say job embedded at least 5 times, but I lost count, frankly, after 5. I'm hearing that high quality professional development understands that teachers come at varying levels and different experiences. And certainly we can think about the different contexts and experiences teachers will be coming back into their classrooms with too, in terms of their own mental health and trauma. And so it will have to acknowledge that variation. I'm hearing that high quality professional development is ongoing. So again, it's not a one-time workshop, but it works with teachers to improve their practice over time. And so anything else that anyone wants to add? I'm sure I didn't capture it all. David.
I would just add, as you're summarizing, Vivian, I think one other piece of it, and I think this actually got raised a couple of times over the course of the panels earlier in the day in different contexts, but the learning that happens in really high quality professional development is not just job embedded and ongoing. It's learning that's actually about yourself and your practice and your relationship to your practice, not just learning about the content of the particular professional development. And so I think, and I hear this in the way that Sherry was describing some of the work that she's done over the last few years with teachers, but there's also really clear parallels in the way that we think about what we know about the way that children learn and develop, right? We don't really actually think that content coverage is certainly not the only, and whether it ought to be the primary objective of a classroom experience for a kid. those connections that you make to the developing identity of a young person are really critically important, and likewise for adults. And so I think here, some of the panelists earlier in the day raised the importance of things like participant action research and various other ways in which higher education works directly with teachers in professional development settings to focus that learning, not just on evidence-based practice, which is I think really important, but also on a kind of self-development and a self-reflective capacity that becomes a really critical part of understanding where you are in responding to your own emotional needs and your own experiences, so that you can show up in a way that's actually supportive of the children that are in front of you.
Thank you. That's a great point. You know, I feel like it would be great to hear an example of what does this look like in practice. Ms. Sherry, do you have one off the top of your head, or maybe David? What does it look like when that all happens? Or Todd?
Hey, Todd has one.
Okay, Todd, why don't you start?
I do have one. I just have to say that all the research suggests that when you give students choice, then they're more motivated. They like it more. So we need to extend the same thing to teachers, because it's the same kind of thing. They need to choose what their PD is. One of the models that we started using, and this is assessments that we did actually with pre-service teachers. We did this one thing that they said was more important than any other learning tool or any other educational class moment they'd had, and it was really simple. It was just this. We asked our pre-service teachers to come together and meet in interdisciplinary groups, and they would bring a videotape of them teaching something. And then they'd say, all right, what's good about what I'm doing? And we forced them just to talk about what's excellent that they're doing. And then we said, are there any questions that you want to ask the other people in this group? And then they'd ask the questions and get feedback on them. Then they'd go back and reteach the lesson to a different group, and then come back and report on that. And they said that was just transformational for them, because the text was the classroom space, and they were really invested in the feedback that would help them improve their practice. It was really simple. It didn't cost very much money, and it's much better than paying a whole lot of money to shuttle all your teachers to a Ruby Pain conference somewhere. I had to put that in, sorry.
Ms. Sherry, do you want to offer your example? You look like you're about to offer one.
So it would be, in many ways, that same kind of thing that, so when I say with the work that we do around teaching professional learning on trauma, that it's job embedded, we have developed our kind of the materials that we work with teachers with, that they do a lot of assessment of there's learning, some core content learning, but then it's coupled with a lot of assessments of how this looks in their classroom, how it looks with the students that they're working with, and so that they can really see how, and that it's communicated, that it's expected that this is going to need to be adapted, and it's going to need to change based on how you teach and who you are and what your personality is and all of those things, as well as what are the needs of the students in front of you. And so that there's lots of, that all of the materials are called just a lot of planning materials to help them apply this learning to their classroom and their needs. And I'll also say with that there's lots of examples. And the reason, a particular reason for lots of examples when we're thinking about, because we work in schools primarily that are very stressed schools, is it's hard to be creative when you yourself are stressed and there's so much going on. And so if we could at least, in addition to the conceptual pieces, and we do this for many other aspects of teacher professional learning around core content, but I don't think we're really still learning how to do this around in the space of kind of trauma, mental health, and well-being. Professional learning for teachers is, I find that a lot of that has just taught the concepts, and teachers will get the concepts, but it hasn't done, we're still just learning how to teach them to go beyond learning the concepts to then examples with what do you do. And like I said, particularly it's what individuals are stressed, and this is a lot of emotional work. And so whenever we can couple the professional learning with what does this look like in your classroom, it just goes so much further because it gives them a starting place. It makes the learning less threatening. It makes the practice of it less threatening. And so all of those things and those pieces is what we mean by making it job embedded professional learning.
Like I said, I'm still learning how to use Zoom 12 weeks in. So let me switch gears a little bit. So many people are concerned about the economy, and for schools, we are facing an inevitable financial cliff, right? As there is less revenue coming in, city and state level. We're very unsure how much federal stimulus money will come into public education. Still a bit of a question mark, certainly not enough has come down yet in the recovery packages, stimulus packages. But regardless, we're facing a financial cliff, and resources will become tighter and tighter. How can schools be preparing, right? And what kinds of decisions do we need to be thinking about at the local education agency level, the state education agency level, to deal with some of these very hard choices that will be coming along and impacting schools at a time, frankly, when more is being asked of schools?
So we started this year in Tennessee with our governor saying he was going to create a mental health trust fund for our school districts, and everybody was thrilled to meet the already, like I said, overwhelming need. And then COVID-19 hit and the budget impacts hit, and that mental health trust fund is no longer going to happen. But I think that, you know, I mentioned the AWARE grants in part because it's federal, right? Because state and local, I think, are really being hit hard by things like, you know, loss of business and sales taxes and things like that, which so many rely on for support and needing to increase property taxes. But I feel like there may need to be, this is something that is maybe a political and policy question. We need to be lobbying for things like that. Unfortunately, those stimulus funds, even though they're intended to hit people, you know, hurting the most, a lot of people won't be hit like that. We have people who, you know, haven't filed or won't file taxes and won't receive, you know, those kind of benefits. And so I feel like we have to lobby for those kinds of uses of resources that will get to those kids who need it most and will supplement schools in areas where there are already glaring deficits. And so I feel this is one of them, right? Those school-based health centers, the resources teachers need to meet children where they are with the traumas they've experienced. Those are the things we need to fight for, and we're going to have to do it, the public, you know, lobbying our state legislators, your representatives, and congressmen who can make those kinds of decisions.
You know, it strikes me, Carolyn, as I hear you talk, that, you know, I'm on Twitter, and every day on Twitter, I see all of these parents saying how much they now appreciate their kids' teachers. Oh my gosh, the appreciation for teachers is going through the roof right now as parents learn a little bit about what it means to school their kids. And partly, so I'm connecting with what you're saying, which is that, is there a way to turn that appreciation for teachers and educators into political lobbying and political support for public dollars in education, which supports teachers, but all these other supports, professional development, all this other stuff that we've been talking about. Because very, very hard choices will be made across this country in Congress and state legislatures and districts. A lot of decisions and very consequential decisions will be made about resources, how much resources and how limited resources are allocated. And we know that that's coming. We don't have to wait for it. We know that all of that is coming. Yes, David.
I think it's also, so I think a lot of what Carolyn was just highlighting is right in terms of advocating for sources of funding that are going to help to offset some of the ways in which particularly local funding is going to be impacted in significant ways. I think it's also important to consider, without altering the total pot of money that we have in a given district, there are ways in which we could increase local control, meaning the power that parents and community actors actually have over the ways that those resources are actually being allocated, that could do quite a bit to redistribute what we already know we have in the bank. And here I'm thinking, of ways in which different panelists across the day today have raised issues connected to some of the protest movements going on around the country right now, calling for reduced funding or defunding of police departments. There's a lot of money spent around the country on school police officers in partnerships with police departments. And I think there's a great deal of reflection going on at various different levels right now across the country about the appropriateness of those allocations. Should we be spending so much money on policing, and should we have such a great intersection between the police and the schools? Those kinds of questions are really important to ask in and of themselves, but they also represent opportunities for us then to think differently about where else we might put that money if we chose not to put it there. And so that's not to say that we don't also need for the resources to come to offset the ways in which states and cities are going to be hit by diminished revenue. But I think there are also things we could be doing in the meantime locally that could really redistribute power in some profoundly important ways.
Yes, Todd, please.
So no one should talk to me about budgeting issues because I can barely deal with my checkbook. But I am up on the research, and a big complaint is that we tend to infantilize teachers, and this happens in North Carolina where I live a lot in terms of them being told what to do and what they need, what new commercial software is going to solve this problem that they paid so much money. That kind of thing happens a lot. And there's a study by Richard Ingersoll in 2017, and he studied 1 million teachers. It's a really robust study. And what he found is that when you give teachers decision-making power, achievement scores go up. And then weirdly, when you also give, maybe it's not weird, but also when you give teachers the power to decide on things like the rules for the school, like classroom management rules, those kind of things, achievement scores go up. In fact, that's one of the biggest things that affects achievement scores. So I've just noticed a lot that particularly women, particularly elementary school teachers in K through 3, tend to be associated with the mindset of the grades that they teach, and are somewhat treated like children. And I wish that didn't happen. Can I also say that I'd like more allocated towards training that's done by persons of color, and also from teachers who have expertise right in the building that are often overlooked.
And can you offer examples of places you've seen do that well and what it looks like? Or even one example?
Well, I haven't seen schools do that thing where they do the training in-house. However, there are some schools that are kind of laboratory schools, and so they will announce that they are experts in trauma-informed practices, and then what they do is they bring in other teachers from other schools into that school to watch them do their thing, and that tends to be very reinforcing.
That peer-to-peer learning. Right? I think many of us in all of our professions often look to our peers to learn and because they understand what we're going through, right? They're dealing with some similar challenges, similar problems, and are often very useful to push our own understanding of the issues.
Can I say one more thing? Sorry about that, I'm interrupting. this was a huge news to me, that I just didn't realize this. You know, sometimes you hear about a school and it's like, they do culturally responsive pedagogy, just awesome. That's what they do. That's what all their success is about. And what I found is that in schools that are really high performing, again, with diverse students, with a lot of poverty, is that they're not just doing one innovation, they're doing 20. So it's this constant effort to get better and to look at a cascade of practices, not just your silver bullet.
Right, not just your quick fix. Yeah. So, you know, another question that's been raised over the course of the day, and I'll pose it to you guys. I think it's a tough one. Not that we haven't had any tough questions tossed at you yet, but is that hopefully we're not just speaking, preaching to the choir right now, whatever that saying is. I'm an immigrant, so I sometimes get my English sayings wrong. But, you know, hopefully, you know, we're not just speaking to folks that already agree with us and see the world in the same way. And certainly as people go back to their jobs, they aren't going to be confronting people who see things in the same way, or who haven't been able to experience this terrific day together. So what are ways that we can broaden the community of folks working on these issues, including people who don't see the bias, their own bias or bias in the system in the same way? How do we deal with that?
Well, I think one of the things that's already been said on this panel is who you engage. And just to bring another example of this, we started looking into what the, you know, in our use of digital tools, right, like online learning videos and things like that are being used in high schools and are disproportionately targeting students of color and low-income students who may be more likely to be falling behind. We were surprised, or I shouldn't say surprised, but the lack of cultural responsiveness and diversity within those curriculums and games and instructional videos that are built into those tools we're using. So as we think of ways that we're going to try and enhance and personalize learning, be aware of that. And so one of the things that came out of our research in our WT grant project was we worked with a school district and one of those vendors that is in all 50 school districts in the United States to make them aware of content after we studied that content that was not only not either diverse or responsive, but some of it was offending and could perpetuate or enhance traumas. And so I feel it's another thing that, you know, we need to be aware of. And so one of the things you have to look at is who is at the table, you know, constructing that kind of those kind of learning tools, and who can you bring to the table to look at how we need to modify them so that they are culturally responsive, they are reflecting the environments in the context of students who are more often than others being asked to learn with them and need, you know, certain levels of self-regulation to learn with them, and are very hard if the content you're seeing does not relate to your life at all.
You know, your comments, Carolyn, remind me of something that I've been pondering as I think about school districts all across the country and state education agencies. Everyone's dealing with this crisis and trying to figure out what to do, you know, and developing plan A, plan B, plan C, because there's so much uncertainty. In some ways, we're at an agenda setting stage because so much has been thrown in disarray, right? And there's so much uncertainty, no one clear path forward. And so we're at a real agenda setting stage. And as decisions are being made under very difficult circumstances, you know, looking at reduced funding, looking at more need than they faced before, are we putting the right processes in place and bringing the right people to the table in that agenda setting? And I'm thinking about what you were saying, David, too, that are we once again, during our agenda setting, leaving out folks of color, leaders of color? Are we leaving out community voices, grassroots community voices? Are we leaving out families? Are we leaving out the young people themselves at this very critical time when important decisions are being made that are so consequential? Are decisions being made for Black and brown youth and their families? Are they being made for them? Are they being made in ways that would fit what they would want to see? So how do we, even in the process we're setting up in our decision making, making sure that they are inclusive? We have about, oh yes, please, David, Todd.
Thank you. I really want a handlebar mustache too, so I look a little more like David. That's pretty damn cool. Can I just say that I'm very concerned about unconscious bias that occurs in schools, and also let's just call it out as just we have teachers that are racist that are in the building, and they have a lot of power because their arguments are very simple. And so there's a good thing to say, thing for teachers to say when someone in the school says something racist. It's this. That's crazy. When you use that language, there's not really a response to that, so that's helpful. But I think besides marinating school culture in this discourse of inclusivity, we also need to let people who are trying to do the right thing sometimes use the wrong language as they're oftentimes wearing a suit of ill-fitting of words, bad metaphor. And I think we need to be patient with people as they, well, not patient, but in the moment, let people work through the language without getting hit in the head when they're trying to do the right thing. So that marinating in that culture of using the right kind of language is important.
I would love to just pick up on something, Vivian, that you said a moment ago and push this idea just a little bit further at the risk of sounding like a broken record on the subject of power sharing. You know, as a white person, it's really important to me that I ask myself repeatedly in my work, what's mine to actually do? And to really think carefully about the moments in which it's important for me to lead, particularly with other white people. And I think Todd makes a really good point about the role that as a white person I have in calling out things that are frankly crazy. But then I think if we take the idea that unconscious bias is actually unconscious, if we take that really seriously, I think it underscores the importance of sharing power and getting out of the way. Because the things that I'm going to get wrong, and I'm going to get some things wrong, are not going to be things that I anticipate. If it were conscious, that would be different, but that's what unconscious bias actually means. And allowing communities of color and leaders of color from within the communities that schools serve to actually lead in making decisions, to really do something that actively disrupts the culture of command and control, both in policy making, but also all the way down to the school and the classroom level, I think is a really critically important part of what it ultimately means to adopt an anti-racist stance to responding to something like COVID. COVID is racialized in a very profound way that I think Masheri did a really nice job of visually highlighting at the top of the call. If we're going to do anything about that, it can't just be a matter of good intentions. It has to be a matter of structural change that actually forces us out of our comfort zone. We're not going to solve this by wanting to. If wanting was the only problem, we would have gotten there already.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, David, and also Todd. Because sometimes in these conversations, we don't focus on whiteness, right? And we don't focus on the role of white people in a white racial hierarchy. So again, on Twitter, I am seeing a lot of, I would say, awakening and a renewed sort of or fresh willingness to look hard at whiteness. And for white men and women and young people, amazing young people on the streets, thinking hard about what their role is and willing to step out and take more risks in confronting racism than I have seen in the past. And for me personally, at least on Twitter, it's one of the few hopeful things I see on Twitter, because there's too much negative stuff on Twitter. So I thank you both for recentering that conversation. I think, and I'm looking to Miss Sherry right now, are we out of time? Are we quickly running out of time?
We are out of time. So do you have any other final comments, Vivian?
Well, I would just thank these terrific set of panelists. I hope it's been as stimulating to the audience out there as it has been to me. Usually I would look out into the audience and I would see everyone's face to gauge it. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that you have appreciated this as much as I have. I'll just offer just a couple of thoughts that I have heard. One is, we have a panel of researchers, and I think what I'm hearing from this panel of researchers is we already know quite a lot from existing research. We do not know everything we need to know. This is an extraordinary moment, but we should be harnessing what we already know from existing research about high quality professional development, about trauma-informed practice, both for students as well as for the adults who take care of them, about the system of coordinated supports among adults that young people need to be successful. We also know quite a lot about structural racism, what maintains it, about anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And we have some quite good ideas about how we can tackle them. We certainly don't know everything we need to know, but we know a lot to build on. And that makes me quite hopeful because we're facing some very hard times, very, very difficult times with COVID in the fall and the winter, with the return to school, with ongoing police brutality, with a financial cliff. Undoubtedly, we have some tough times ahead. And so we need a lot of the fortitude, and we need to bring everything that we possibly can to the table collectively to fight that and to leave, to fulfill our responsibilities to this next generation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank everyone.